Today we're going to talk a little bit more about Green Chapter 7 because there's a lot of good information in there, as Green gives us the big picture about assessment, and it helps us think about how the trends might be affecting our own beliefs and then our own practices. To start, let's do this warm-up activity. Take a moment and answer each of these questions. Please pause the screencast to give yourself time to answer. How would you define language ability? What different abilities does that involve? How far can the ability to use language transfer from one context to another? How long do you think you would need to adequately assess someone's language ability? Now that you have your own ideas written down, let's look at some of the ideas in the chapter. Starting with remembering how Brown talked about that assessment was part of teaching and we use that to evaluate our students. Now in Green, Chapter 7, he explains that the trends in assessment affect how we teach, and how we teach affects the trends in assessment. So there is a relationship there that's another relationship, not just that assessment is part of teaching in a day-to-day activity, but also in the broader sense. And Green gives us these 6 phases or tendencies or shifts in language assessment. Again, I think it's important to look at these trends and shifts to think about how we as an individual instructor might be holding on to some of the ideas in a good way, taking what's good, but sometimes we hold on to ideas just because we think that's what assessment is supposed to be. So the goal here is to be mindful of the benefits and potential pitfalls in each of these methods. Let's look at each one individually. Starting with the pre-scientific in the traditional method. This is when language teaching was grammar translation, and the techniques were translation and grammar exercises and heavily on essays. Unfortunately, this came about because of a change in the subjects that we teach. At first, education included teaching the classics, like Latin. And when we started teaching English, the language instructors were Latin teachers. So they used the techniques they used to teach Latin, a dead language, in a very different language than English, to teach English grammar. Because, again, the focus was on grammar, because in Latin, the focus was on grammar, not so much communication, because nobody was speaking Latin, of course, at this time. So you see that holdover from Latin in this pre-scientific traditional method in grammar translation. The next slide here has us looking at examples from the 1913 Certificate of Proficiency in English. And this is on page 176 and 177. And when we look at this, think about how is this type of assessment is different from more recent tests that you're familiar with, and what criticisms would you make of the test using the terms of this course? Validity, reliability, practicality, beneficial consequences. So we see that the one example is translate this paragraph into French. Keep in mind that this is for the Certificate in Proficiency of English. Under grammar, the testees had to give a past tense and past participle of each of the following verbs and dividing them into strong and weak with explanations. Then on the second page here, there's the examples of correct and justify four of the following sentences. The first one is, I hope you're determined to seriously improve. I suspect that the idea on that one is that you should not split an infinitive. To improve is being split by the adverb seriously, and that was one of those rules that English grammar instructors created to reflect the rules of Latin, because they are the same. They are within the morphemes within the same word in Latin, so they can't be split. And again, that held over to English. Describe fully the articulation of various vowel sounds in the ordinary spelling, which the letter O is used to represent. So and then the last one is write an essay on one of the following subjects: political movements of 19th century literature, Elizabethan travel and discovery. I'm sure that you can find lots of concerns you have as this being an English test, mostly the validity of that. What skills and competencies do we want to measure, and where do we see this here? I want to also bring you to another question. Green states that certificate of proficiency in English is actually an achievement test. So I want you to take a moment and look at how Brown defines a proficiency test versus an achievement test, and to identify the features that indicate that that exam that we just looked at is more an achievement test than a proficiency test. Okay, moving on to the second phase or tendencies of language assessment is the audiolingual method. The techniques really focused on clearly right and wrong answers, because the psychometric testing phase was really interested in controlling variables and getting very reliable measures. This was, again, a wider in society, where society was enthralled with scientific discovery and the rigors of science, and that also spilled over into language learning. But the phase moved to recognize that humans are not just in a lab learning language. So the psycholinguistic and the sociolinguistic parts of language learning came more into prominence, moved back into prominence, and we started teaching using the natural approach. We're just going to hear lots of language, and it's going to emerge. And we found that that wasn't enough. So the tendencies moved again to a communicative thing. We need to communicate with others, not just hear it and read it. So task-based assessments and teaching came into vogue strongly, and we still see this in our assessments at this point. We see the value of doing task-based learning and communicative learning, and we see the value of assessment tasks that reflect real life with integrated skills and real language use. You might be surprised to see that this isn't the last phase. According to Green, this is a phase that has passed. So let's look at the next one. The next phase is called formative testing. And look at the language teaching here has a focus on behavioral, objective, and mastery learning. And we see this because a lot with the emphasis on making learning objectives that are student-centered and observable, measurable. We want to observe the students mastering our learning objectives. And our assessment techniques have moved to make sure that we are the assessments measure what we are teaching, and that we can use our assessment results to inform our instruction, inform the next instruction, remediation. This is why it's called formative testing. So thinking about that for a minute, what is the potential value of an assessment that is exactly like the textbook? What is the potential value of an assessment that's unconnected to instruction? So exactly like the textbook fits very much with the idea of behavioral, objective, and mastery learning, right? We want our tests to reflect how we've been teaching. But there's also a value of an assessment that's unconnected to instruction. And that's the idea of, is what we're teaching going to help our students in just that task, or will that help them take that skill and move beyond the classroom learning and apply it to other places? We can also ask a similar question, right? What's the potential problem if the assessment is exactly like the textbook? And what's the potential problem if the assessment is unconnected to instruction? Do you see how this becomes a balancing act where maybe we want to do both? And in what context would we want the assessment to more closely match the textbook, and in what context would we want it to be a little bit farther from instruction? Now, the last phase or tendency is assessment for learning. And this is the idea that we're not just wanting to measure behaviors, because learning is social and learning is constructed by the learner. And we see this with more conferencing and one-on-one feedback and supporting the learner where they are in moving to the next stage. Self in peer assessment. These are all looking at assessments for learning. How can the assessment itself improve learning? And in this same vein, we've started to ask if it's appropriate for the top level on our assessments or our rubrics say the words native-like. Or maybe should the goal or the target of the language proficiency be precision, appropriateness, and ease? And we might also want to think about, how does a context influence the goal of instruction? We might want to say, who should make that decision if the goal is native-like or precision, appropriateness, and ease? Some learners may not want to sound native American English-like, because that might sound like a betrayal of their identity as a bilingual speaker. Some people might want to sound native-like in their second language. Now, going to the task 7.1 on page 171 in green, he asked us, in our view, who should take the main responsibility for assessing language learning abilities? The language learners themselves, teachers, specialists, or employers? And the second question he asked is, what should each of these groups know about the qualities of language assessments? So what I'd like to do is kind of tweak this for a discussion board post. Think about one of these groups: the language learners, the teachers, the specialists, employers. And I want you to answer these two questions. In what context should that group that you chose take the main responsibility for assessing the language learner's ability? And what should that group that you chose know about the qualities of language assessment? Just pick one of these and think about those two questions.